This program is about both learning and putting that learning into practice. You'll learn how to change your thinking process and your emotional reactions. Each day you will have a morning contemplation and an evening meditation. The contemplation is to give you some ideas to think about, to contemplate on. In the evening, the meditation will be utilising what you have considered from the morning, but it is really just for you to simply relax and listen to. You could think of these as one to learn and one to do or apply that learning. Or even that the philosophy shows you the way and the meditation gives you the means. This is, however, not just a series of recordings that you simply listen to. You do have to do some work as well. You need to spend some time deliberately considering key ideas. I'll guide you on a path that I know works, but it's your journey and yours alone. I will walk it with you, but no one can walk it for you. This contemplation is by way of introduction, and while most of these will last 7 or 8 minutes, this one will probably be twice that long because we're covering some more information to get you started. Now, we will consider what emotions are, how they work and impact upon us. We will look at why it's healthy to have some control of them and how to go about doing that. You should understand that people have been trying to do this for a very long time, and with, it has to be said, varying degrees of success. Some cultures, like the ancient Greeks, thought that emotion came upon us from an external source, and were, in many writings, the suggestion is that they were the means that the gods used to play games with us. They would direct our behaviour by putting an emotion upon us. Now, some cultures have tried to simply suppress emotions and often paid for it with very poor mental health. So when I say control, I never mean simply suppress. A Japanese Zen practice is archery or kaido, and part of the training involves trying to feel neither elated when you hit the target nor disappointed when you miss. Clearly this requires a great control of one's emotions, and frankly is much harder than simply shooting a bow. See, if you can do this, then you'll certainly keep your head in a real battle, staying focused and calm, shooting carefully, with perhaps a cavalry charge coming straight at you. And one thing you'll get from such training is that in the attempt you discover the realization that while some control is possible, you can't and shouldn't try complete suppression, because in fact the suppression of your emotions is impossible, in much the same way that trying not to think of something is impossible. You can choose one thought instead of another, but you can't pick one thought and focus on not thinking it. And so with emotions. You can deliberately redirect the energy of one by replacing it with another. While you can't, for example, focus on fear to stop feeling fear, you can, however, choose to interpret the physiological experience as excitement instead. Notice that if this control is done deliberately, your mind will do it itself. If it's not done deliberately, I should say. Your mind will do it itself, but sometimes in very unhealthy ways. The suppression of an emotion without choosing a healthy way for that energy to be expressed, it's like keeping the lid on a pressure cooker indefinitely. No one wants to be around when it finally blows. The emotional energy of a suppressed emotion needs to be vented either deliberately in an emotion of your choice, or it will be vented in a random way, sometimes with surprisingly shocking results. Sigmund Freud called this sublimation, where a destructive and therefore suppressed emotion would be redirected into more civilized or useful activities, or it would find a way out, often in some neurotic obsession. First, I need you to understand the mechanism by which emotions function, and the ideal example of that is our survival mode, a chemical state of your mind and body which is not necessarily linked to the actual situation in your physical environment. Now, you've almost certainly heard of the fight or flight response. It is what happens when you perceive or believe yourself to be in danger. You can think of it as switching on your survival mode. And if you can learn to have some control over this, you will understand the mechanism and method for having some control over all your emotions. Your internal alarms basically go off, and you look around for both the danger and the means to escape or hide. Your sympathetic nervous system is activated and your body gets ready for action. Your heart rate increases along with your blood pressure. Your digestive system stops to save energy, and if the threat is severe enough, it can actually empty itself from both ends. Cortisol and adrenaline flood your body, and your immune system goes on hold so that you have more energy to deal with the very immediate threat. You can get tunnel vision to enable you to totally focus on the threat, and you can even go deaf as your brain blocks out all but the danger. Once the initial trigger has fired, there are actually 5 possible responses to this. 5 variations of possible chemical balances and corresponding behaviours. So you might, for example, fight for your life. You might run for your life. You might fawn to placate a dominant and dangerous individual. You might resign yourself to a horrid death, or you might completely freeze. Now, all of these responses have evolved to deal with threats common to people over the last couple of 100,000 years. In the modern world, however, the threats have changed. It's true that you might still fawn to a dominating human, maybe a drunken father or abusive partner, a bullying boss. You might need to fight off an attacker. You might run from a large herbivore, maybe a bull, or you might freeze when confronted by a carnivore like a police dog. But more often than not, you're more likely to feel threatened by an abstract idea. Maybe the looming productivity target or tax bill, the threat of a pandemic or a war far away, the threat of redundancy. Dangers that our hunter-gatherer ancestors never needed physiological systems to deal with. The absence of something to actually fight or run from means that we tend to freeze with lots of energy coursing through our bodies that is nowhere to go or be used. Some people will feel the physical symptoms of this and describe it as anger. Some will call it excitement, and some will call it anxiety. It tends to be perceived as a negative energy. Actually, we are waiting for something to happen that we can respond to. That's what our body has prepared us for. We're in survival mode, having a physiological response best suited to hunter-gatherers with a large animal or another person to deal with. As a Kung Fu master, I've spent years training people how to deal with and how to control and direct these physiological responses. I'm sure you can imagine all of the martial arts skills in the world won't help in an actual conflict situation if you're frozen and unable to move. Now, because we're in survival mode, our brain is looking for dangers, and our thinking will be about how to respond, what to do, how to escape, who to fight, where to hide. This is essentially what happens when we find ourselves worrying and troubled, even laying awake at night, going over all the scenarios that might go possibly wrong in the future and what we can do about them. This system is the greatest hindrance to our emotional control. When we have no control over what happens and have no way of really knowing what might happen, we get lost in a downward cycle that can only be exacerbated when we're too tired to think clearly and can't find any sort of resolution. So our anxiety and fear can only become worse. Eventually, after protracted periods of being anxious, waiting for the action that our bodies have prepared for, we can become almost numb. Our alarm systems are ignored. We are both tense for action while unconsciously blanking out the alarms. A negative energy with nowhere to go, aiming for a sort of emotional flat line. Using teaching from ancient mind control systems and modern neuroscience, I've distilled this system to work for you to control your thinking and your emotions. Think of this as kung fu for the mind, because that is where your fight is. You may have come across mindfulness and meditation, but found it a bit theoretical at best, often oversimplified and taken out of its original context in a way that is intended to make it easier for modern Western thinkers to relate to, but often actually has just made it sound a bit wishy-washy and vague. Perhaps your human resources manager or your personnel officer or even your well-being coordinator, depending on where you live, has read a book and prepared a PowerPoint presentation on mindfulness. But I'm guessing you left it not really much wiser about it, and you're here now listening to me because you still have an issue. Let me clear up one or two things about meditation first. Broadly speaking, there are two types of meditation, and you'll be doing a bit of both. In the ancient Middle East, an idea of meditation has come down to us from the Bible and the Quran, and the word often translated as meditate literally means to chew the cud. If you're not familiar with the term, animals like cows will eat grass, put it into one's stomach for some digestion, and then later they'll regurgitate it, chew it over, and get obviously more nutrients out of it. This is called chewing the cud, and before they then swallow it again to another stomach. The idea here is that you meditate on an idea that you have previously learned. You bring it back to mind, chew it over, get more nourishment and more benefit from it. Okay. Now, in the Far East, we get the idea of meditation that means literally to sit and be still, sit and relax the critical mind, learning to not think. This will enable the total relaxation of the mind and the body so that it can repair, and it actually permits more internal communication between unconscious and conscious. I'm not going to list all the benefits from the literally tens of thousands of clinical studies that have been carried out upon meditation, because if you're listening to this, you almost certainly have some idea of the benefits of meditation. I am, however, going to emphasise just one. What many people consider the number one benefit of meditation is that the very bit of your brain that seems to be most exercised and strengthened is the bit of it that enables you to pause between stimulus and response. Something will happen that would normally cause you to have a particular emotional response, but you have a moment in which you can recognise what emotion is about to fire, and in that moment you've just enough time to choose whether to have that response or a different one. And that is the most amazing tool. If you're the sort of person that likes some of the science, let me simplify it like this. When we are very mentally active, or when we're critically aware, shall we say, your brain is producing beta wavelengths when very anxious in very high beta. When you're relaxed, not especially engaged, your brain is producing alpha wavelengths. As these alpha waves get lower, you move into what's called theta. Now, theta waves are typically what is often called hypnagogic. Okay, it's often a hypnagogic state. It's that state we pass through between sleep and waking, or between waking and sleep, when we're not quite fully awake but not yet asleep, conscious but not really thinking. And this is the ideal state of brain in meditation. The reality is most people will actually meditate in low alpha. That's quite normal. To actually reach that theta state, for most people it takes years of practice and is still relatively rare. It will be a rare expert that can do that every time. Now, one reason that guided meditations work well is because most people find meditation difficult. It takes practice, but it is a natural state and you definitely can do it. It's a bit like an exercise. You focus on something that is complicated but has no meaning, like a flame or the ripples on water. I'm sure you've noticed how you can get totally lost just staring into an open fire, or sitting by the river, again just staring at that flickering of the water. Well, when you do it deliberately, we tend to find that our minds wander. We notice the wandering and bring it back, and then it wanders and we bring it back, and we can start to get frustrated with ourselves and make it hard work before we find that the self-criticism is the very thing our minds are distracted by. So think instead of a chin-up, a pull-up. You lift yourself till your chin is above the bar, and then you gradually drop down. We get to the bottom and lift again. Now, the exercise is the act of pulling back up. In the same way, the noticing of our wandering mind and pulling it back to the mantra, the breathing practice, whatever the subject we're trying to focus on is the exercise of meditation. It is the very bit of brain that does that you are making stronger. So don't beat yourself up. Just notice, pull it back. That is the bit of brain that enables you to have the pause between stimulus and reaction, that enables you to choose your emotion in a given situation. Now, the structure of these daily meditations is based around the image often called the Bhagwa. Now, you don't need to know anything about it to use the program, but for those interested, I thought I'd just mention it. I find it makes a good map to evaluate character traits, and that's how I often use it with our black belt students. It can be used like a flow chart or a thinking process, and in Feng Shui it is almost literally used like a compass. In this instant, I'm using it as a set of steps to take in developing a solid strategy for controlling one's own thinking, and thereby one's emotions, and with that the ability to really take back control of one's whole life. You see, there's often a very good reason why such ancient ideas persist.